Hey everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. And I must say, I find that ironic. I was trying to be funny, I was trying to be awesome, put some snowflakes in. And as I'm doing this podcast, it is February and it is 75 degrees out. So, yeah. But that's not what the Cold War is about. Because the Cold War, there's no real war in the sense of that we know of. Instead, we're going to talk about blockades, isolation policies, embargoes, but we also will get into the Vietnam War, as well as the failed invasions. Let's discuss and move on, shall we? We're going to talk about the new United Nations and what war was like when it's not exactly war. Soviet and U.S. troops first met up at the Elbe River in Germany in 1945. The UN, United Nations, was formed that year. Allied cooperation didn't last. At the end of World War II, after Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta in 1945, Europe was dividing into two regions, and both regions disagreed over what to do about Poland after the war. Heaven forbid that the people of Poland be brought into the conversation. Post-war, most Americans were incredibly optimistic about their influence. The Truman Doctrine expressed U.S. determination to stop the worldwide spread of communism. After the war, the Cold War stalemate divided Germany, and especially the city of Berlin. The United States decided to rebuild Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. It's a very important term, guys, the Marshall Plan. You should write that down. The Soviets were invited to join the Marshall Plan, but refused. And during the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union created international spy rings. After World War II, Western leaders perceived the Soviet Union as the center of a world revolutionary movement, while Soviet leaders felt themselves surrounded by Western countries and their North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, founded 1949. The UN provided a venue for face-to-face debate between the two sides in the Cold War. NATO was born to stop the spread of communism, and the USSR created the Warsaw Pact in turn. The United Nations was established in 1945 with a General Assembly, a Security Council, a full-time bureaucracy headed by a Secretary General, and various specialized agencies. All signatories of the UN Charter renounced war and territorial conquests. But in practice, the UN was seldom able to forestall or stop any international conflicts. And that will be seen especially when we hit the Rwandan genocide. And when we study that, and then when we actually watch the movie Hotel Rwanda, you will see just how powerless the United Nations actually was during these conflicts. The decolonization of Africa and Asia greatly swelled the size of the General Assembly, and this assembly became an arena for African countries as well as Asian countries to express their opinions and to be able to form their newly independent nations. The resolutions carried great weight in the early years of the United Nations. The influx of new members made the General Assembly more concerned with poverty, racial discrimination, and the struggle against imperialism than with the Cold War. And so Western powers increasingly ignored the General Assembly. Between 1944 and 1946, the Western capitalist countries created a new international monetary system in which supply and demand, capitalism folks, determined prices, and that included a system of exchange rates, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. The Soviet Union, which was suspicious of Western intentions, established a closed monetary system in which the state allocated goods and set prices for itself and for the communist states of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union presented itself to third world countries as a liberator from colonialism and imperialism, and many newly independent states opted for Soviet-style economic models, preferring that to capitalism of their former colonial rulers. With the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the Soviets opposed any movements for freedom of speech, association, religions, or self-determination. The U.S. economy recovered and prospered during and after World War II. The economy of Western Europe, which was heavily damaged during World War II, recovered in the post-war period with the help of the American Marshall Plan. In 1954, the U.S. interfered in Guatemalan politics. Guevara had been in Guatemala City and was convinced that the U.S. represented a threat to freedom. And that's really going to play a role in how Guatemala develops their political system. And that is just one of the many instances where U.S. interference leads to problems in that country. Western European governments sought to increase their role in economic management during this period. In 1948, Europeans initiated a process of economic cooperation and integration with the creation of the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, OIV, which expanded its membership as it developed into the European Economic Community, or Common Market, in 1957, and then into the European Community in 1970. Prosperity followed, with European living standards rising and the creation of a mass consumer society. The Soviet Union and Eastern European states relied on the government to determine the production, distribution, and price of goods, aka a command economy. In the communist states, the recovery from World War II was rapid at first, but in the long run, the Soviet and Eastern European economies were unable to match those in the West in the production of consumer goods, housing, and food. When Stalin died in 1953, some Eastern Europeans saw this as a chance for reform. Anti-government demonstrations in Poland were inspired by religion. In 1956, students, factory workers, and middle-class professionals staged the Hungarian uprising against the Soviet-imposed dictatorship. The U.S. used its Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and covert operations to assist when needed. So, a couple of things I want to look at are what's called social realism in art. And this was very popular in the Soviet Union as well as in China. And it shows the beauty that can be found in working for the greater good. So, West versus the East. The rapid establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe led to the U.S. to perceive the Soviet Union as a worldwide enemy. Communism had to be stopped. Following the establishment of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, 1949 and 1955 respectively, this prompted particularly by the Western powers' decision to allow West Germany to rearm within limits. A third Great War did not break out in Europe, but the Soviet Union and the West did test each other's resolve in incidents such as the Soviet blockade of West Berlin, the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the West's encouragement of divisions within the Warsaw Pact. Soviet power was used to ensure obedience of Eastern European nations such as Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In Korea, Soviet and American occupations of zones north and south of the 38th parallel led to the establishment in 1948 of a communist North Korea and a non-communist South Korea. North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950 marked the beginning of the Korean War, in which the U.S. came to the aid of South Korea, while China sent troops to assist the North. A truce in 1953 fixed the border again at the 38th parallel, but no peace treaty was ever formally concluded. So here we have a couple fun little facts. So projections of where attacks could take place, where some in fact were planned to, but luckily, we'll talk about this one, or where incursions also took place, supported by U.S. or Soviet troops, or I should say NATO troops. The U.S. and Vietnam. In 1945, after having to help push the Japanese from Indochina during the war, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed an independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam by forming the Viet Minh to bring an end to French colonization within Vietnam. And after winning independence from France, communist North Vietnam supported a communist guerrilla movement, the Viet Cong, against the non-communist government of South Vietnam. And John F. Kennedy decided to send military advisors to assist in South Vietnam. Again, you have the idea communism is awful and it must be stopped at all costs before it spreads. And that's really one of the reasons why the U.S. gets involved with North and South Korea and why the U.S. gets involved with the Vietnam War. The biggest concern is that communism is going to spread, that it's going to be the domino effect. When one country falls to communism, the others surrounding it will quickly follow suit. It must be ended. The U.S. was concerned that the communist Ho Chi Minh would win the elections, so it gave a preemptive strike. In 1964, the U.S., under President Lyndon Johnson, decided to send troops for a full-scale war against North Vietnam. This was the first televised war, and President Johnson gained congressional support for unlimited expansion of U.S. military deployment. However, what would soon be learned is that a clear victory was not going to happen. And unable to attain that victory over the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies, and also facing a massive anti-war movement at home, the U.S. ended its involvement in Vietnam in 1973. In 1968, the Viet Cong launched a counteroffensive against Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The war caused many Americans to question whether democratic governments, such as their own, were necessarily good, and communism necessarily evil. This was the most unpopular war within the U.S., and it would inspire a number of anti-war, pro-peace movements. And a big one, the hippie movement. Peace, not war. And the hippies would begin to lead what would be called the counterculture movement. Assuming everyone here is sort of Woodstock. So just throwing that out there for you. Think about how that movement starts and why. What you will also see throughout the Vietnam War, that is 64 of full-scale war to 1973, are massive protest movements and really the rise of the power of students at universities, which we'll get into a bit later. Also, I'm going to take a look at the offensive, major operation of North Vietnam into South Vietnam. The existence of weapons of mass destruction affected all aspects of the Cold War confrontation, spreading fear of nuclear destruction throughout the world. Fear of nuclear war seemed to be realized when the Soviets deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, but Khrushchev backed down and then later withdrew the missiles from Cuba. And all of this knowledge, these new tactics, goes back from the Manhattan Project with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. The number, means of delivery, and destructive force of nuclear weapons increased enormously, but at the same time, the Soviet Union, the United States, and other countries made some progress on actual arms limitations. And after 1972, the superpowers began the slow, arduous process of negotiating weapons limits. Rather than attempting to keep up with the expensive Soviet arms race, the European nations sought to relax tensions between East and West through organizations such as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that led to the signing of the Helsinki Accords. Space exploration was another offshoot of the nuclear arms race because the ability to launch satellites and to send manned rockets into space was understood to significantly be equivalent to achievements in the military sphere. If you can send something into space, you can send a missile across the ocean. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union grew tenser in the 1960s. However, by the mid-60s, the two nations seemed to reach a semi-peaceful coexistence. The greatest achievement was the SALT Agreement of 1972, also referred to as the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. All right. We're going to wrap up today talking about decolonization and nation building within South and Southeast Asia. After partition in 1947, the independent states of India and Pakistan were strikingly dissimilar. Pakistan defined itself in terms of religion. fell under the control of military leaders and saw its Bengali-speaking eastern section secede to become the independent nation of Bangladesh in 1971. India, a secular republic with a 90% Hindu population, inherited a larger share of industrial and educational resources and was able to maintain unity despite its linguistic heterogeneity. In Southeast Asia, the defeats that the Japanese inflicted on the British, French, and Dutch forces in World War II set an example of an Asian people standing up to European colonization. In post-war period, nationalist movements led to the independence of Indonesia in 1949, Burma and the Malay Federation in 1948, and the Philippines in 1946. All right, so you might want to freeze this slide for a few minutes and just take a note on, first of all, who over here had formerly ruled these now modern day nations, and what years they achieved independence. And you'll also notice that because we're talking about decolonization 1947 to 1990, this map is no longer 100% accurate. But I promise you, we will get to that. If you have any questions, you know what to do. Send an email. Otherwise, have a great night, guys. Cheers.